Welcome to the virtual speaker series. My name is Adian. I use the pronouns he, his, and him, and I'm the intern for the Men Masculinities program at Cal Poly. The virtual speaker series is when we invite guest speakers to come in and discuss a topic related to masculinities that is also related to their area of expertise or their experiences. And today we have Serafin Aguilar Jr. coming in to discuss machismo. Serafin is a graduate of the University of California at Santa Barbara. There, he earned a degree in sociology and also studied Latinx communities as well as the Chicanx educational pipeline. He earned his master's in Education and Student Affairs Administration from the University of Vermont. And while he was there, he also did research on Latino motivation and self-efficacy in higher education. At Cal Poly, he's been a coordinator for 3 years for student development, and he's also the co-chair for the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. He's also been an integral part of this year's Men and Masculinities program, especially with the Men of Color Success Initiative that just launched. I'm really excited to have him here. I'm really excited to hear what he has to say about machismo. And after he's completed his presentation on machismo, he will be answering questions presented by Cal Poly students about machismo. Let's get started. So I just want to say thank you for being here. You've been a huge influence on the Men of Color Success Initiative this year with the Men Masculinities program. We really appreciate that, and I appreciate you taking the time to do this. So I'd love to just hand it off to you to jump right into this topic of machismo.
All right, then. So, hello again. My name is Serafin Aguilar Jr. Use he, him as pronouns. Um, Today, really, I wanna take a little bit of time to engage in this conversation. But in general, given that machismo is, we'll find out it's an offset or part of masculinities. We'll talk about power structures, talk about masculinity and all of it. But really, the goal of the presentation is just to examine machismo and what it means in and for the Latinx community. I hope to provide some parallel between the varying definitions of masculinity and machismo as they are used in a U.S. context to help create tangible paths of addressing problematic behavior at the end of the presentation. So we'll move forward. Before we get fully started, I do want to acknowledge that the land on which Cal Poly sits carries the heritage and culture of the indigenous people of San Luis Obispo County, the Yak Tichu Yak Tilhini Northern Chumash tribe. We honor the indigenous people's connection to these territories and respect the land on which we gather today. I think it's very fitting that we do an acknowledgement today. I mean, obviously, a lot of Cal Poly presentations and I'm not going to have the land acknowledgement, but I think right now it is very fitting that we take the time to acknowledge the peoples before us, because our work is grounded in indigeneity, right, and forms of knowing and understanding oneself, and masculinity goes deep rooted into generations. So I think it's more appropriate than ever to have this land acknowledgement. So when, like I was talking to you earlier, I think before we have the conversation around masculinity, machismo as a whole, we have to define power structures and understand, or at least get a grasp of what we mean by power structures. So I really like this quote by Bitlawa, that talks about social power and defines it, right? It is the capacity of different individuals or groups to determine who gets what, who does what, who decides the what's, and who gets and who sets the agenda. In essence, social power is the capacity of different individuals or groups to decide or to influence. We can keep thinking for along this note that injustices and inequality of every kind is actually an expression of power or a symptom of a power structure, if we think about it in those terms. So I know it's very brief, but it's at least a frame to get our mindset around when talking about masculinity and the power structure that comes with that, because it's so ingrained into our culture. And I'm saying culture a lot, and what the U.S. and um, a lot of other words that are context based, right? So we have the United States, and which is why I have this image here of North America, right? Because we have the United States, and we got to think about masculinity and machismo as the U.S. versus how it's used in Latin American countries. Um, we also have to think about how Latin American countries frame their machismo versus how Mexico frames their machismo. Because in a lot of research that is done, machismo is really accredited to being Mexican American, and having that identity, right? So it's important to think about the context in which we are using it in. And even in the U.S., machismo could be defined differently depending on where you're at, right? In the Northeast versus here in the Southwest is going to be defined differently because of the people's that ethnic and cultural backgrounds that come from each place, and like waves of immigration. But context is really important overall in general when it comes to any form of power structures and subordinated or dominant identities. It's important to see the power structures that are at play in those societies in those specific eras, right? And as we think about it specifically at Cal Poly, like how is the machismo here different than the machismo that might be somewhere in Los Angeles with a higher Latinx population, right? So think about those things. Um, so now we're getting into the stuff that kind of we are a little bit more interested in, right? We have the evolution that I call the evolution of masculinity. And I start with just simple masculinity because it is the broader term, right? The broader social construct. And I actually have the definition that came from an official Mexican government page. So I actually Googled masculinidad, which is the literal translation of masculinity. And it's derived from the Commission to Prevent and Eradicate the Violence Against Women. So this is similar to the White House, certain commissions posting a definition on an initiative that they're taking charge in, right? So the translation of masculinity in masculinidad, I translated to English. It stated an arbitrary social construct resulting from patriarchal origins and masculine dominance in relation to gender. It is comprised of values, definition, beliefs, and indicators of being needing to be or not to be male, but overall, their status in relation to women. So I like the definition because it talks about masculine dominance in relation to gender. It doesn't necessarily say, excuse me, a man-woman dichotomy, because as we know, masculinity affects everybody. But then thinking about it, it does talk about specifically the relationship to women, right? Because that we in the context in the society that we've grown up, right? Thinking about those contexts in the United States, it is very man-woman dichotomy here. So although the definition can't expand on it, it does bring into the fact of the context that we're living in. Moving forward, I have that the American Psychological Association says that society has socialized boys and men to conform to a definition of masculinity that emphasizes toughness, stoicism, and acquisitiveness and self-reliance. They say that this leads to aggressive, emotionally stunted males who harm not just themselves, but their children, partners, and entire communities. That's kind of moving towards more so the toxic masculinity definition, right? So toxic masculinity is that phrase is derived from studies that focus on violent behaviors perpetuated by men, and is designed to describe not really masculinity itself, but a form of gendered behavior that results when the expectations of what it means to be a man goes wrong, right? So this is a cultural idea where strength is everything while emotions are a weakness, where sex and brutality are measurements while socially defined feminine traits are the means by which your status as a man can be taken away. And that's specifically toxic masculinity. Society focuses and thrives off this definition. Ads, as you can see, targeting men. I thought about this morning when I was showering. I have Dove body soap, but there's the Axe man spray, right? Like, get the dirt that men build up throughout the day. Take that off, like it's so gendered, and it uses the form of toxic masculinity that we are used to and the definition of it to normalize toxic masculinity, right? So we have men of color have so many pressures around them to conform that really toxic masculinity has become the definition, right? And it's about moving beyond that to engage a broader context. So not just ads, but also men creating like things like the man card, right? I remember growing up and being like, oh man, oh, whatever you did, that feminine trait that you just portrayed, you got to give up the man card, and it's ridiculous, right? But it's how we've been socialized. Overall, it hurts men more than anything because they aren't able to fulfill fruitful mental and physical well-being and or healthy relationships as a whole, right? That's why I say if the goal is education and reform, then there must be an intention. Then we have to be intentional with the language that we use to describe men and men of color. All right. So it says, where do we go? I'm talking about masculinity research, other forms of masculinity that might not be at the forefront of what we know today. Connell actually talks about masculinities as plural, as multiple. And Connell states that they are not equivalent, masculinities are not equivalent to men. They concern the position of men in a gendered order, defined as the patterns of practice by which people engage that position, saying that all genders play a role in the position of men in a gendered order. Masculinity can be perpetuated by people other than men. And also, Connell mentions that there's an abundant evidence that masculinities are multiple, with internal complexities and even contradictions, right? Also, that masculinities change throughout history, and that women have considerable roles in making them while they're interacting with boys and men. So this part I kind of want to hold on to, right? Of that all genders play a role in the position of men, but also that there are multiple masculinities, that they're complex, that they contradict themselves and change throughout history, right? That's what Connell's was. And then I looked at one of the theories that I really liked and have been really trying to use more because I see it underused is Plex et al.'s masculinity ideology. So this refers to the beliefs about the importance of men adhering to culturally defined standards for male behavior rather than actually possessing the characteristics expected by men. So men and people around them should have the autonomy to set the importance of those standards instead of having society dictate it for them. And it's a part of creating a world that allows the men to set the importance of meeting set standards. Masculinity ideology refers to both the psychological and sociological conception of norms. So I bring those two because we're talking about machismo in the United States, when machismo is inherently Mexican and or Latin American in origin. So you have a lot of old school, right, for lack of better words, saying of understanding machismo. But the matter of fact is that in this context that we're in, we're talking about educated men of color who are coming to college and making sense of what the world means to them, right? And I think it's important to bring that in because they are Latin American as in hyphenated. Like from a Latin American country, but also American, born in the U.S., the 1.5 generation and beyond. So now the meat of this machismo, right? What is it? What is that term that is really used, like I was talking about toxic masculinity, right? So interchangeably with masculinity, and probably for good reasons, right? Like it's important to recognize that men are being problematic and do characterize some toxic behaviors when just talked about in bulk. I think the machismo aspect is a very, very specific lens that we have for Latinx men. So if you ask someone to describe machismo, they'll probably tell you negative aspects of masculinidad, or what we know as toxic masculinity. But there's also a positive side to defining machismo, in which positive characteristics and traits are shared. Um, so looking at Arciniega's quote here, machismo vaguely refers to a standard of behavior exhibited by men in Mexican culture, right? This one was a very specific study, and a lot of the significant values Mexican and the Mexican American experience. So thinking about Arciniega's study, they found that negative portrayals of machismo derive from hypermasculinity, and those negative portrayals are what they consider traditional traits, traditional machismo, right? Because that's when we think about normally is traditional machismo, but the negative portrayals of machismo derive from hypermasculinity. Positive sides of machismo refers to a connection to family and chivalry. This study actually talks about machismo versus caballerismo. So we're starting to go into that caballerismo side of connection to family and chivalry, but they're not separate identities, right? It's not like polar opposites where you can't be one and the other. It's just more of a scale that our Siniega talks about in terms of machismo, whether it's positive or negative. Um, so, for example, traditional machismo showed higher results from Spanish-speaking homes compared to those in mixed or English-only homes. And the reason why I brought that significant part of the study is because of what we're talking about contextually, right? In the Spanish-speaking homes only, or in Mexico, right? Because there was just full Mexican folk in this study, there's a higher result of traditional machismo, aka negative machismo. But then in mixed or English only, which you could reasonably say that that's in the U.S., those results go down for the traditional machismo. And then and we think about that timeline that, or the did I lose you? No, okay. My Zoom came up. So I look at this aggressive and violent, and then toughness, traditionalism, and protector and provider. To me, they are all in one, but also it ranges from very negative to like, yeah, acceptable. And all of these are definitions of machismo, really. It just depends on which one you want to focus on, right? So to wrap it all up, really, and to bring it all together, I think about the hyphenated generations and beyond, thinking about how do we move forward with the context that we've just learned about power structures, about the evolution of masculinity, about the research that has not really been prominent, right? There's a lot of research about toxic masculinity. There's not a lot of research that support masculinities or masculinity ideology. So when we bring all of these together, how do we move forward for the men of color, for the Latinx men who are struggling with this machismo, right? With these ideas of what it means to be a man, coming from both a U.S. context and a Latin American context. And I think about education. Higher education levels did show to decrease the traditional machismo score, and in Arciniega's previous study that I mentioned before. So thinking about higher education as a place of reform is really crucial. And how do we, and so then we can start to focus on how do we get more men of color? How do we get more Latinx men, not just graduating from high schools, but also applying, being admitted to, and then succeeding and graduating from four-year universities as a form of helping everybody, right? And then moving forward, I really like the idea of Atalua has been one of my prominent readings since I started my feminism career in undergrad and studying feminism and feminist studies. Atalua has been critical to the backbone of my Latinx identity, and really using what she uses as the mestiza consciousness and borderlands to explain and help explain to men what it means to be living in as a hyphenated person here in the United States with machismo weighing on both sides, right? So Borderland details the invisible borders that exist for a growing population that cannot distinguish these invisible borders, who instead have learned to become part of both worlds, worlds whose cultural expectations they are still expected to abide by. So I know of a lot of men, including myself, who see father figures and other masculine identities, seeing how they portray themselves and seeing like, okay, that's what I'm going to do, but knowing that I live in a place where I'm not going to be fully seen as just masculinity. It's always going to have machismo tied to it because of my brown skin, right? So thinking of living in the borderlands as a way of freedom and as a way, a consciousness of understanding how to be in these places and understand that it is a struggle, right? Part of this borderlands being in the middle, it means being confident but not dominant, being nice but not getting stepped on, and being strong but not too sensitive at the same time, right? So balancing all these emotions, and learning what is right and what is wrong, but with higher education, right? And then finally relinquishing power that is innately given, right? Holding each other accountable, identifying injustices and doing what you can help, educating people who you care about, right? And starting to use the words love and care and for other men around in your life, right? You're teaching folk as a form of love, and you're educating people as a form of love, and recognizing social structures that create inequities, and in order for you to step in and address those inequities. So it's kind of what I have. I have some of these resources here that I'll keep them up, but there's a lot of research that can be done about masculinities, about machismo. It's not just one straightforward aspect of Latinidad. So I think it's important really to talk about machismo and how it's different from what we know in Mexico to what it is in the United States as hyphenated and beyond, right?
That was an amazing presentation. I just have to say that was way more informative than I was expecting, but I learned so much. I love what you ended with there about teaching people that you love as an act of love, and because that's holding each other accountable. That's amazing message, and I feel like that's something we are definitely trying to do a Men Masculinities program, and especially with Moxie. Um, so thank you for that presentation. I learned a lot, and I hope that our viewers do as well. So given that, I would love to just jump right into the questions I have from Cal Poly students about machismo. I'm just going to hit off with the first one is, how common is machismo today?
So if we're using the things that we just talked about, right? I think it's ever present. Machismo is always going to be present because the presentation really wasn't about let's call it something else because it doesn't exist anymore. It's about reframing in order to educate Latinx men. So that still says that it's present, right? The negative traits of masculinity being exemplified by Latinx men is still ever present, and it's because of the power structures, right, that we hold and the innate privileges that are given to us as men. So I think it's still present, and it's something that each individual man has to work on in order to help alleviate some of those symptoms that come from machismo.
Yeah, absolutely. That was a great answer. So for our next question, you kind of talked a little bit about how it's changed and how it's the same, but this specific question asks, has machismo remained the same over time, or has it changed?
I think machismo, masculinity, toxic masculinity, all have ebbed and flowed, right? In throughout the history. I think it's important to think about the history of Latinx immigration into the United States to really solidify what the role of a man was in old times, right? And seeing how that role has changed. So that's why I feel machismo has changed, right? To get into like anecdotal quotes or just like personal type of things. Like I have taken what my dad has given me, and I make sense of it and decipher it, decide what I want to pick up, because I have that ability to do so now, right, with my education. So I do feel like it has changed throughout time. When the first wave of Latinx immigration came here, it was solely to provide food, right? And we think about flagship times of immigration, like the Bracero program. It was meant to bring in Mexican American workers, and then they went back home, and Mexican American or Mexican men at that time did exactly that. Like they came, they worked, got some money, and there's no problem with that, right? And it was the form of, I'm the breadwinner of the family. I got to do what I need to do, regardless of what it takes to provide. Versus now, I think we've transgressed so far, where my idea of providing, what does that mean, right? And if I'm in a partnership with somebody, to do, what role do they play in providing as well, right? But being okay with not being the sole provider, and having those types of conversations, right? So there's definitely people who still are and hold traditional sense of machismo in terms of like what they came here for in old times, but there's also people who have progressive ideas of machismo as well, right? And are leaning more towards different types of masculinities as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I do want to ask just one more question, and it is actually something you mentioned. And correct me if I say this word wrong, but caballerismo, is that?
Yeah, caballerismo. That one actually refers to. Wait, what is the question? I'm sorry.
No worries. Yeah, it's just like, how does machismo compare to caballerismo?
Yeah, I think hot take, but I think they're all in one, all in the same, right? One in the same. Is that the same? One in the same.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's from how I understand it, right? It's, if we think of masculinidad as the overarching aspect of it, you have toxic masculinity, aka machismo, on one end of the spectrum, but then also chivalry, right, or caballerismo, and on the other end. All of them make up masculinities, or forms of masculinities. So I don't think that it is like opposites per se, even though I just described it that way. I know, but it's more of like, there's multiple truths in this world, so you can have opened the door for someone, regardless of gender, and say like, I'm doing this out of respect, and hold traditional toxic traits. And you can also hold traditional toxic traits from the machista traits, right? And say, no, I'm doing this to provide for my family, right? Like, I don't, I don't want my spouse, traditionally in a heteronormative lens, right? You're thinking about, I don't want my wife to work because I love her and I'm the one who's to provide for her. And it's kind of like, that's sweet. Also, you shouldn't limit it. Like it's like and we've learned a lot since then. So caballerismo, I think, as a whole, really talks about the chivalrous aspect of it. It's what we would consider like knighthood, right, or cavalries, and being uh, still strong and poised and confident. Nothing really that seems negative, right? But it's in terms of how you enact it, right? If someone who's overly confident can come off as arrogant, right? And sometimes when you don't get your way, that's what the toxicity comes into play with, right? So these are deep rooted ideas that are not individual ideas, and separate, but they are not mutually exclusive, essentially, right? Like they do play on one another, and can interact. So I think caballerismo is on 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 par with a lot of the masculinities that are moving forward, and it's like a piece of the puzzle, right, of masculinity, such as machismo is the same, a different piece of the same puzzle.
Absolutely. That was, yeah, you really hit it on the head there. I know you mentioned a little bit in your presentation, but that was a great expansion of just that idea. So that's all the questions that we have today. We are running a little bit out of time, but of course I do want to say thank you again, just for taking the time to be here. I know you're already doing so much for our program, but it's really important to just share some ideas, and like you said, these different ideas of masculinities and how they all play out and come together, because they do impact everybody's lives, whether or not you're masculine identifying or if you are a man. So it's just really important. So I just want to say thank you again.
No, thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk on the screen for a while and on an area that I'm really passionate about. So anytime, man, and really anytime, I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for watching, and if you want to learn more about the Men and Masculinities program, check out our website, our Facebook, our Instagram, or subscribe to this channel. If you want to learn more about the Men of Color Success Initiative, which is focused on increasing retention rates for men of color at Cal Poly, they're offering support, resources, and community. Also check that information out. And with that, I hope to see you next time on the Virtual Speaker Series.